As I mentioned to you before, I rebuilt this gearbox a long time, well, about 40,000 miles ago. So the shaft was good and everything was good. But what I want to show you is a few little tricks if you're putting a new shaft in. And this again, very similar to LT77. A new shaft will come perhaps with grease on it, like as a preservative. The holes in here are very small, like in here. So I'm just going to pass a bit of brake cleaner, not brake fluid, in there. Get my airline, come back with the airline, and we're going to blow it out because the shaft is hollow. You see the brake cleaner come out? We're going to make sure that there's nothing in there, no dirt or debris, and it's nice and clean. And then we'll give it a quick going over on the outside to make sure it's picked up no dust and dirt. And another good tip is to blow your blocks off. I always like to use a bit of softwood in the vise so I can really clamp it down tight. So next thing we're going to do is just we'll do a quick explanation why it's got holes in. In here there's a provision to put oil into the middle of the shaft, and so that oil travels up into the needle bearings, through the needle bearings, and right out to the end of here where you've got your primary pinion. Now I'm going to explain to you once we've got this assembled how the oil gets down the shaft, so just remember that. But what we're going to do now is we're going to put the shaft in the vise like this, tighten him up. Now we're going to assemble this shaft. So I got a little bit sidetracked because a customer came, and yeah, I forgot what I was doing. So anyway, what we're going to do now is we're going to get this big pile of gears, and they're all nice and clean. I'm going to spin them upside down, and we're going to put them back on to the shaft the same way we took them off. So we're going to give this a bit of a cleaning up, and now we're going to fit the second gear onto the shaft, and then we're going to assemble these synchro rings. So first of all, we've got a brass sort of inner one, we've got a steel outer one, that's like a double-sided one, so that goes onto there and it locks into these little teeth just about here. You can see them. So that gear drives this inner, and then we put the outer. And again, if we look at the difference between, this is the fourth one, I got a little bit mixed up earlier because I had things to do. The synchros are different because they've got different teeth in the back, and it's only the fourth one on this shaft that's different. So we're going to put that on, line it up, and away we go. The next thing we're going to do is going to put the synchro hub on. The synchro hub is marked with the first gear, so that goes upwards. So this goes towards second gear and it's marked quite clearly. So slide that on over the top, and then again turn your gear, put a little bit of pressure on the top, and it'll just clip down like that. So that one's on. The next thing we're going to build up again, this assembly for the synchro. So we're going to put the big ring on first, then the steel ring, put it on the right way around, and then we'll put it on like that, and that will lock into the gear when we put it on. And then this ring here like that. Now the LT77S used to be exactly the same as this, so it was a funky design. So there's been a progression from the LT77. The LT77S's were on the V8s and the 200 TDIs. So, but the 300 TDIs, they sort of went a little bit wild on that. Again, so what we've got now, we've got our first gear bearing inside the housing or inside this sleeve, and then we're going to drop that on. Again, all the time we're looking for the gears. I do it, you know, it's funny for me when I do it on my own all the time, because I'm always sort of looking things, and I never really talk to myself all that much. But you get used to just automatically looking for bits and pieces. Slide it on, turn it till it locks, and that's going to be good. So the next thing, we're going to push the bearing on with the good old British scaffolding pipe. Let me go and set up the press, and we'll show you how that works. So with the assembly in the press, we're going to push the bearing down, again using this old British scaffolding pipe. It is tight, because you don't want it to come off. There we go. That's that bit done. Next, we're going to go across to the bench and we're going to assemble the third gear. Whilst we're back in the vise on the first to second gear, we're just going to make sure that the synchro works nice and snappy, if you see what I mean. And the gears are, and just that nice feel. It's funny, Land Rover go into all this detail about shoving bloody shims here and, you know, checking distances, but honestly, when you rock a gear and it feels nice, and you can always tell. So there's that. So next again, a bit of ATF. I use ATF instead of engine oil because the engine oil is good for the LT85. And the LT77, well, they're a bit more robust, but these are a bit feeble. So we're going to put the gear on, we put the bearing on, we're going to put the gear on, again checking the teeth. And now, again, we're going to assemble the third gear synchro. I hope you can see that, how it's going. I'll have to sort of get a better stand because that's the highest it'll go. But you get the idea. And then you see how you just keep turning them and they'll all drop into place. It's like magic, really. And again, look, you see we've got the three little notches on there. The three notches point downwards towards third gear. And again, see, turn it, it drops down. Next thing is this little special spacer. Put that on the top, and then we go and press the bearing on in the vise. Let's go and do that. I meant to say let's go to the press, not the vise. Sometimes I don't know what I'm talking about. So just before we push it on, you want to get yourself a little socket that will sort of nice snug fit over the nose of the shaft, but at the same time it presses on the inner side of the bearing on here. Wait a minute, let's balance that out. Ooh, it's not going to go. Let's just lean it against here so you can see. So bearing, socket. Socket fits inside the bearing and it doesn't press on the outer cage, because if it presses on the outer cage it'll ruin the bearing. So the bearing on the end of the shaft, get our socket ready, make sure it's the right way up, by the way, and then simply press it down. It's as simple as that. Now you could do it, I don't recommend you hammering this, and this is one of the reasons why I bought this particular press, is because it's nice and progressive. If you start hammering bearings, you can jingle up and down all the synchros in there, and because there's so many, if you're out of line a little bit, the damn things are going to jam, and that's the last thing you want. So a press is really handy to have. It's not super critical, but I don't know, you know, you could make a little bench press or something like this with using a trolley, using a jack or something, but you know, if you're hammering up and down, these synchros are so fragile, and because there's such a space, when you're banging it, the synchros can jump out of the little sockets, as I showed you. It's really important. So one of the next things to check is the selector forks. The selector forks are almost identical to the LT77. This piece here is replaceable, but this piece, this selector here, you've got to buy on a shaft complete because you can't get the pins out of here. So we'll just assemble that rough. If you're going to change your gearbox over to from an R380 Discovery to an R380 Defender, or vice versa, whichever way you wanted to go, this shaft is different. On the Defender it's longer. On the Discovery it's shorter. Now Ashcrofts now, cleverly enough, do a little adapter so you can use Discovery boxes onto Defenders, and it puts a little extension on here. Works quite well. A little bit expensive, but cheaper than buying all this assembly. I'm going to show you how you put this together in a little while. What else is to inspect before we put it back together? The casings. I'm going to take this cover off and show you what's inside. Nothing much really, just a couple of bearings and an oil seal, but we're going to take it off just to ease assembly. Well, not so much ease assembly, but just to show you what's inside there. Again, there is the pin. That should be a nice sliding fit, which it is. Now, this gearbox has been left quite a while, and I didn't realise at 40,000 miles ago that inside it's got like a lacquer, and it seems to be, I never noticed before, I never paid much of attention, but because I saw it was black. But what it actually is, it's the old gearbox must have been so hot, it's baked oil around the gearbox inside. So I thought it was painted black. When I looked at it, I thought, oh, that's a colour, it's like a casting. But when I'm looking at it more, it's like a finish, like a burnt on finish, like an oven, you know, with old fat burnt on. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to put some oven cleaner in it, and I'm going to try it to see if oven cleaner will get that off, because I don't want those metal particles in my gearbox, and so it's got to come out. So that's the next job, cleaning up that bit. We've got the main shaft back together, but one thing I forgot to add, and sometimes, well, you take it as granted that you're going to put new synchros in and things like this, but sometimes synchros might not be too bad and you could use them again. Who knows? I'm talking about the little brass rings, these things here. So what do you do to check them? Well, you offer up your synchro, and it should be a minimum of 20,000ths of an inch or half a millimetre between the gear and the brass ring. So check that. If it's any less, replace the ring. Same goes up there. Now, obviously you can't do this. Well, you could do this one. Yeah, let's do this one. Put the shaft on. Now carefully just take up the tension on this and check under there, and it should be, if it's 20 thou, replace it. Now a little word of warning. I have had some of these synchros be a little bit too big, a little bit too tight, and what happens is when you assemble all your shaft, they're pushing too tight and it won't allow the gears to freely move. So that's most important. Make sure everything's freely moving. The clatter you can hear at the moment is the synchro rings jingling about with each other, that's nothing. But just make sure everything is moving. Alright, you've been warned. But obviously, like I say, if you buy a kit, you buy it in good faith, but I have had 1 or 2 synchros that go wrong. So what is the next thing? Well, I cleaned the casing out. I actually ended up giving it a bit of a sandblast because the oven cleaner worked alright, but I had a bit of an extended lunch and it all dried out. So I gave it a bit of a sandblast. I gave it a clean in the parts washer, and I gave it a clean out with brake fluid and made sure all the holes were correct. But now we're going to assemble this bit. Now if by doing this bit, by putting the shafts in, then we'll go on to something else, because then we can get this bit out of the way. But like I say, we're sort of going to do inspection and assembly at the same time on this video, because I'm looking at different things at different times, and I don't think I can do it like the other gearboxes because there's a lot to see. So let's get the gear cases together and we'll show you how to put them together totally differently to the LT77. So you can see I've got my frame here on the bench. I've got the end cover for the gearbox casing, and I'm going to bolt it to the frame very similarly as we did with the LT77. But in the difference is that in here the shims, let's see if we can get one out, the shims are behind the bearing. A little bit different, so there's a different technique. So let me bolt this on and then we'll show you what we're going to do. So I've cleaned all the parts up in the gearbox, and what we're going to do now, we're going to assemble the shafts so we can check the end floats. This is important. It's a little bit easier to do like this, but the LT77 was easy because you could shim it from the end cover like this piece, but this isn't too bad, and you've got to get it done right, and you just do it once and that's it. So what we're going to do, we've already checked all our bearings, and I'm assuming that you've put new bearings in, but you don't always have to put new bearings in. Just make sure that they look right and they're not too bad. Because the taper roller bearings, we can take up the preload or the end float quite easily, but we've got to check them just in case. I mean, these have done 40,000 miles, they're just like they've come out the box. So first of all, we're going to put a little bit of oil on the bearings, on there, and we're going to drop this one in the casing. Now I have put a shim underneath the bearing. I'm using the old ones, but I might edit this and put an explanation how we do shimming. Perhaps I will, and then you can see what the difference is between preload and end float. The next thing we're going to put in is our lay shaft. We slip our lay shaft in like that, and then we're going to put, I'm going to put the synchro ring on just in case we forget it. Is that the right one? Yeah, that's the one. And then our primary pinion, again a little bit of oil in there, move that to one side, drop that in, job done. Now you think, well, what the heck's he doing? What's he on about? Well, what we're going to do now, we're going to drop on the cover. Alright, we're going to drop the cover on, and we're going to put, first of all, the bearings into the cover, and then put this cover on the cover, if you see what I mean. I'll do it down here, then you can see what I'm talking about. I'll just slip this to one side. I've cleaned this housing up really nicely now, as you can see. There's, you know, it's really nicely cleaned up. So, and I've blown out, because I used a sandblaster, I blew out all the holes and made sure everything was nice and clean. So I'm just going to go and get some, oh, I've got it upside down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and get some high-low sill and put this cover on. I've put some high-low sill on the cover and I've just smeared it around very thinly with my finger. I didn't put it on with a bead. This part isn't coming off again. Now in the book they're recommending you not do this with the oil seal, but it's the only oil seal I've got and I know it's in good condition, so I'm going to be very, very careful. So I've got the bearings in place and you can see they've got a little snap ring on the outside. We don't take that off, we leave that in place. Again, we've checked the races, they're absolutely perfect, but like I say, if you put new bearings in, you can miss that stage out. So what we're going to do is put the cover on, squidge it about a bit, and then I'm going to tighten it down. Boring bit, I'll miss that bit out. You can see there's a nice even bead come out of a high-low sill all the way around. And the next thing, we're going to just look inside the casing and make sure it's nice and clean where the bolts have come through. Make sure they've not pushed any silicone inside, which I like to be clean like that. So next thing, oil the bearings up, make sure they're nice and turny. We're going to put this cover on and off a few times, so you know, bear with me, you all will become clear. So with the dowels in place, pushed down, we're going to just take out our holding bolts for this. I'll take this one out first, this is easier to get out. Move this one about a bit. Oh. Bloody things never come out when you want. Wait a minute. Right, with the holding bolts out of this here, it's going to be a sort of a bit basic. At the moment I haven't put the springs or the detents back in here, nor have I put on the shaft with the selectors on, and there's a very good reason. So what I'm going to do now is put the cover on. Just going to make sure which is the top. This is the top, and we're going to put it on. Now we're not putting any sealer on at this stage. There. So there's the top of the cover on. I'm going to put a couple of temporary bolts in here. On either side. I'll move this forward a bit further. Oh. There. So now we're going to turn it the opposite way around. With the gearbox, I put this on the floor because we were working too high and you couldn't get the camera up high enough. So what we're going to do now, we're going to bolt down these, we're going to push the pins in, so they're locked, the covers in, and we're going to put a series of bolts round the outside to clamp this down with no sealer. And what we're going to do is we're going to check the end floats of the shafts. I'll get the gear out and we'll set it up and you'll see what I'm talking about. I just move the camera back a little bit further so you can see what we're doing. So I've set the gauge to 0. I'm going to put a pry bar under here and we're going to lift the shaft up and get under it. And there you go, and I'm going to have a look at it. It's 0.02 of an inch. Now obviously I set this up before, you know, a couple of years ago, about 40,000 miles ago. In fact I can't remember when I did it. But according to the book, it's got to be 0.4 of a thousandth up to 2/1000 of an inch. I can't do it metric because I've only got an inch DTI. So that's within tolerance. It's not too bad. We can shim it a little bit more, but really to get 1/1000 of an inch is pretty fine. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move the gauge over to the lay shaft and do the same thing again. Now, if the clearance is too much, then we have to add a shim, and I'm going to show you what we use, and we used in the LT77 to shim up the shafts, and I'm going to show you how you shim up the shafts really. So say for example we've got this little setup. So this piece here is your shaft, this is your bottom bearing, and this is your top bearing, and this black bit here, if my Sharpie will still work, it's getting a bit dry now, is your shim, and this piece is your top cover, and you can see there's a gap there. So what we're trying to do is we put a known thickness of shim in, which we're going to call A, and then we're going to, this is your dial gauge on the top, so we go with the shaft at the bottom, we're going to set that to 0. Then we're going to lift up the shaft, we're going to lift it up so that this shim will now take up the space of this gap. So that gap could be, so A equals 0, B, which we'll call the gap, equals 10. So we need to add a 10th thou shim to make that perfect with no end float or no preload. Now this is important. If we want to have, if the manual states that we need to have a 1/1000 of an inch preload, we need to add 1 thou to that total there, 10, to give us 11 thou. If it's saying on, for example, C, it needs an end float of 1 thou, we then need to make that 9. Alright, so that's quite simple. The problem is, these shims are around about £4 or £5 a piece, and they're all come in different increments, which is kind of tricky. Sometimes they're in 2 thou increments, so you can't really get it exactly right. So what I was saying earlier, there is a really good idea that's come from Ashcroft's, and they sell this kit here, depending on what gearbox it is. Like this set is for an R380 suffix J gearbox. And what they do is they do some really thin little shims, and a complete range from thick, really thick thin shims to thin things, and sort of medium, all sort of a really good packet of shims. So then you can get it really accurate by putting one shim on top of another. So don't be afraid if you get a shim. Let's use this for an example. You need to get an extra 1/1000 of an inch, so you can actually put two together like that. It's still the same, but it does save you running out and buying shims, and then you find out, you put it all together and you find out you got the wrong one. So really a good investment is the Ashcroft sets, and they do those for all sorts of bearings, for the transfer case and all the gearboxes, so well worth having. Easy. So what I'm going to do next is going to take the measurement of the lay shaft and see what happens there. So I've set up the gauge with a little ball in the top. I've moved the mag mount because I had to put it on the reverse idler because I couldn't get the shaft's too short. So what I'm going to do now, with the hose clip around the shaft, I'm going to put my pry bar on and pull up and see what we've got. And we've got a bit of movement, about half a thou. That's within tolerance, that's pretty good. So I'm quite happy with that. The shims didn't really move from the last time I did it. If you look back on the video, that clip I just showed you about shims, you'll understand, because I don't want to do it twice and it gets a bit boring doing it 2 or 3 times. So that's good, but I'm going to show you a way that if you have to change the shims, how you do it in this particular transmission. In the eventuality that the shims are too, you need to put shims in or subtract them if these shafts are too tight. You see, what you're supposed to do is put smaller shims in first. Now, I don't really have a great selection of these smaller shims. So if there's too much end float, you've got to take this cover off, like this, pop out the bearing, change the shim for either a thicker or a thinner one. It's usually best if, like I said before, it's usually best if you start with a thin shim and then you can calculate by adding on the thickness that you require. And this is the beauty about the 300 TDI as well. Even though it's a pain to do, you can actually change the shims, put the cover back on, check it, put the cover back on, keep checking it until it's right. So they are in a way quite easy. So the next thing we're going to do is, again, we're going to put the cover back on again. Now we know our shims are correct, like that. There we go. Push the dowels through, put a couple of bolts back in, and we're going to flip it back around and we're going to start to assemble this transmission.